Okay, good morning or good afternoon, wherever it may be when you get to hear the Spectrum Update. This is WISPA's Spectrum Update panel. With us today, we have myself, Mark Radabaugh from Amplex, and also a board member for WISPA. We have Louis Prats, our Vice President of Policy, Richard Bernhardt, our Spectrum Advisor, and Steve Curran, DC Counsel. We'll be going through a variety of bands, kind of working from low to high. And to start it off, we have TV white space with Louis.
Thank you, Mark. Next slide, please. Okay, just make sure we're, next slide, please. So the TV white space, NPRM, this is actually a very exciting development at the FCC because TV white space is, because it has below 1 gigahertz spectrum, that means it propagates and its engineering characteristics allow it to deploy signals farther and actually through buildings. And what we've been trying to do with a bunch of other parties such as Microsoft is encourage the FCC to change the rules to enable broader coverage areas in rural areas. So one thing that we're very pleased to see is that the February 2020 NPRM proposed to permit fixed devices to operate in TV bands with a higher power delivery in less congested areas. It seeks comment on what's the right definition of less congested areas. And as I point out here, WISPA requested this proposal. I won't go through all of the details of the proposal here. Part of the reason why I put this detail in here was so that the audience members could see exactly what the FCC's proposals were. And if there's any questions, they can contact me on my email address. Next slide, please. Another interesting proposal and another one that WISPA asked the FCC to tee up in an NPRM was increased antenna heights. What the FCC is proposing to do is exactly what WISPA asked, which is increase the maximum permissible antenna height above average terrain for fixed white space devices operating on channels 2 to 35 from 200 meters to 500 meters. And again, this is something that WISPA requested. A kind of a wrinkle to what this proposal has in it. This is something that WISPA did not propose, but this is what the FCC seeks comment on. Because the NPRM proposes increases in permissible radiated power, it proposes to increase minimum required separation distances. So please take a look at the details of these proposals. And if you believe that WISPA should be trying to push back on some of the details of these proposals, they're very technical. Please contact me and I will make sure that we have our technical consultant and other folks look at this carefully to make sure that we make the right arguments before the FCC. Next slide, please. There are a number of things that WISPA did not ask for, but are also teed up in this NPRM. Coordination procedures. This procedure was advocated by Microsoft and includes notifying white space administrators and broadcasters operating on a test basis on 30 days trial authorization. Again, please take a look at the proposals the other proposals that the FCC teed up, especially the one for Internet of Things. I know that there are a number of WISP operators who are looking at the possibility of deploying Internet of Things. Please take a look at these proposals and see if you have any advice as to how WISPA should advocate on these very detailed proposals. Next slide, please. So at the moment, here's what we want the FCC to, we want to focus our advocacy on NPRM, promoting FCC's proposal for higher power and increased antenna heights, relax out-of-band emission limits. The NPRM noted our arguments, but did not seek specific comment on what out-of-band emission limits should be allowed. So this is when the FCC puts out its when the FCC publishes the due dates for the comments and reply comments, these are areas at the FCC that WISPA is going to focus the FCC's attention on, and also directional antenna characteristics. Next slide, please. I believe that's my last slide. Yep.
Okay, so there is still some action happening in TV white space. We haven't seen a lot from manufacturers, though there are some manufacturers bringing equipment out in it. With that, we'll move on to Steve's 2.5 gig.
So thanks, Mark, and thanks for all those who are taking time out of their schedules to listen to this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2.5 gigahertz band. Almost 200 megahertz of spectrum, and it includes a combination of broadband radio service licenses that are commercial and educational broadband service spectrum that is for now and very near future will change, but is now has some educational restrictions associated with it. Most of the licenses, I should say some of the licenses have 35-mile circular areas. These were not geographically designed in the first place. They were site-based licenses, but gradually over many, many years, it's turning into more of a geographic-based service. BRS licenses often cover BTAs, but where there was an existing licensee before the FCC conducted that auction, you're going to see licenses, donuts and holes. Donut where the BTA is, and a hole where the licensee may have been. Where you have these circles overlap, we have a very technical term for how we deal with that. It's called splitting the football. Just imagine two circles, and you just draw a chord where those two circles intersect, and that's how you describe the protected geographic service areas. Next slide, please. So Sprint has been a major player in the 2.5 space. For a time, it was Sprint and Nextel, and it was good if you were a licensee because you could get them to bid against each other for your spectrum if you wanted. When Sprint bought Nextel, that took the market down to basically one buyer, with some exceptions that we'll talk about a little bit. So Sprint will be rolling out LTE in their urban markets, and my experience is they've been generally unwilling to share their spectrum or to divest of it, but they will be willing to lease or sublease or trade spectrum to rationalize their spectrum position, and done a number of transactions where spectrum has been traded, sometimes area for depth, and sometimes it's just been sort of channel for channel. We know that Sprint is out there looking to acquire more spectrum, and we're not real clear on what the short-term or the long-term effects of the T merger will be. Next, please. So last July, the FCC released an order and a rulemaking proceeding. The rules will become effective on April 27th. There's a long lead time here because there's some tribal aspects to the order, and the FCC wanted to give the tribes a meaningful opportunity to take care of their issues, and also wanted to give the educators some time to adapt to these new rules, which are significant changes. So one thing the FCC did was it eliminated educational use and leasing restrictions. So as of now, there has to be a certain amount of spectrum capacity that is left over for the educator to use for their purposes. That can go away on April 27th. Right now, EBS licensees are not permitted to sell their licenses to commercial entities. On April 27th, they will be allowed to do that. The FCC said that they won't rationalize these rounded GSAs to push them out to the county boundary, but will instead auction white space or unassigned spectrum according to county, including an overlay of these EBS GSAs. And the way that would work is If you're an incumbent in a given county or multiple counties, but you don't cover the whole county, you and other people will be able to bid on what's left over in the county. But if you lose your license, the person who acquired that county license will inherit your vacated area. And the FCC is now in the middle of a tribal priority window that allows designated tribal entities on rural reservation lands to get access to spectrum essentially for free. Next slide. So the band plan for new licenses is going to be in 3 different chunks, the way it's going to be auctioned off. 49.5 megahertz, one of the blocks. 50.5 megahertz is another one of the blocks. And then there's separation from some additional channels before you get to the G block, and that's 16.5 megahertz. Now, I will say that within each of these spectrum blocks, don't automatically assume that every county has all 49.5 or 50.5 or 16.5 megahertz. It may very well be that some of that spectrum is encumbered with existing incumbent licensees. So you may find that if you think you're bidding on a whole county, you may only be bidding on a certain amount of spectrum in that county, and you may only be bidding on a portion of the county. So please be sure to do your due diligence, get some engineering expertise and some mapping help to so you know exactly what you might be bidding on. There are bidding credits that are, if you have average gross revenues of 55 million or less, I believe over the last 5 years, or average gross revenues of 20 million or less over the last 5 years, you can take advantage of a 25 or a 15% bidding credit. Or if you're serving a predominantly rural area and you have 250,000 or fewer subscribers, you can claim a 15% bidding credit. That's going to be a lot easier to qualify for than it would be to demonstrate your gross revenue is below one of those 2 caps, simply because of the amount of data and information the FCC wants and their affiliation and control rules that are very extensive. Next slide, please. All right, so there's build-out rules associated with these new licenses that you may be able to get. So if you're doing a mobile or a multi-point design, you have to demonstrate reliable signal coverage to 50% of the population in the licensed area within 4 years of when your license is granted and 80% within 8 years. If you're doing point-to-point, it's based on links, so 1 link for each 50,000 persons in the licensed area within 4 years, and 1 link to each for each 25,000 persons within 8 years of license grant. For tribal areas, those time periods are cut in half to 2 and to 5 years. I guess not cut in half, but to 2 and 5 years. And if you miss that first build out, that 4 year, or 2 years on tribal lands, then your final milestone is going to get truncated by 2 years. In other words, from 8 to 6, or for tribal areas from 5 down to 3. So please keep in mind that there are consequences for not meeting that interim build out milestone that you have. Next slide, please. So keep in mind what some of the opportunities are here as we go through the process. We're going to be talking about a lot of mid-band spectrum the FCC is going to be making available. And that's CBRS, C-band, and 2.5. As you think about this, don't think just about one or the other, but think about how all these things might fit together, where there's 2.5 spectrum, because it's not available everywhere. One thing you may want to do is work with a tribe. They have until August 3 to file for spectrum in their designated rural area, and they can partner with you. Do note, as we just talked about, that they have a shorter build-out period. We expect that auction is going to come in 2021. That will be after the CBRS, the RDOF, and the C-band auctions. So think now about what spectrum you might want to go for. Think about the timing. When do you need the spectrum? Think about what the propagation characteristics are of each of the band and the equipment that's available. Think about how much spectrum is available in the markets that you want. For 2.5, it might be a lot, it might be none. That might push you into one of the other bands. Think about what some of the costs are, relocation costs, SaaS fees, whatever. So give those things some thought, get yourselves educated as you start thinking about what your mid-band spectrum plan is going forward. So next slide. All right, so we want to move into the 3.1 to 3.5 5 gigahertz band. So in 2 years ago, Congress adopted the Mobile Now Act, and it requires NTIA to submit a report on the feasibility of allowing commercial licensed or unlicensed use of 450 megahertz between 3.1 and 3.55, sitting right below the CBRS band. And NTIA is supposed to work with FCC to identify at least 255 megahertz for mobile and fixed use by December 31 of 2022. And of this, at least 100 megahertz is supposed to be licensed for mobile use, at least the spectrum below 6 gigahertz. And NTIA put out a report that identified 3.45 to 3.55 as being the most promising for sharing in the near term. Next, please. So what are the current uses of the band? Because there's a lot of incumbency that's taking place in this 450 megahertz. First, federal radio location. You also have amateur use from 3.3 to 3.55 and Doppler weather radar licenses there as well. Aeronautical use for the federal government, space research use in part of the band. You also have power companies and municipalities in Alabama, Georgia, and Colorado that have some licenses in the 3.1 to 3.33 band. And the FCC has noted there's hundreds of experimental licenses and STAs, special temporary authority, throughout the band as folks try to prove the business case and test technology in this particular band. Next, please. So late last year, the FCC adopted a notice of proposed rulemaking. It's a first step to allowing more commercial use. So that first step is the elimination of amateur use in 3.3 to 3.55. WISPA and a whole bunch of other folks supported this and said this should be an extension of CBRS. WISPA in particular said this should not just be another band that's delegated to the mobile carriers. That's one of the principal reasons that we chose to participate in this proceeding. Obviously, the amateur radio users have opposed this pretty strongly, as they often do. The notice also seeks comment on what are the appropriate relocation and transition mechanisms that the FCC should employ. WISPA didn't comment directly on that, but that is a question out there. The next steps are going to be sharing versus relocation versus where do we move folks to. So there's a fair amount of chairs that still need to be moved around between now and the end of 2022. So next slide, please. Okay, as I mentioned, the next steps are to look at the NTIA report, figure out how much clearing and sharing the FCC may be able to do, and what's going to be the regulatory structure. Is this going to be licensed? Is it going to be unlicensed? Is it going to be governed by a SAS or a similar type mechanism that will allow different kinds of use in the band and working around incumbents? So that's it on that band. Long-term play here, but WISPA will stay on top of it and keep filing comments as it's appropriate. Okay, Louis, back to you to talk about the CBRS blanket waiver.
Thanks, Steve. Louis, you ready on
Yep, sorry, I had to take myself off mute. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Yes, so I'm very happy to talk about this one because we actually achieved an important victory, policy victory, in the CBRS blanket waiver. So the history of this proceeding dates back a little bit to 2015, when the Commission adopted the CBRS order that established a three-tier mechanism for sharing with federal operations and other incumbent users the 3.55 to 3.7 gigahertz band. This is, as for those who have been following and very interested in CBRS and the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, this is this is the band that's also subject to the auction that will start on June 25th, 2020. Part of that order established a transition mechanism for incumbent fixed wireless service licensees, like a lot of WISPA members who have Part 90Z 3.65 gigahertz licenses. And for the vast majority of these licensees, their licenses expired on April 17, 2020. In October 2018, WISPA made a very wise decision, I believe, in terms of looking at how this transition was going to CBRS. In about around 2018, they realized that the FCC had started a new rulemaking proceeding in CBRS. Actually, it started in 2017. Instead, that's because the new Republican administration at the FCC wanted to move away from the census tract licensing, much smaller geographic area licensing for priority access licenses, and other changes that they wanted to make to the rules that were adopted in 2015. WISPA realized that this rulemaking proceeding and other developments within the band, including the slow certification of spectrum access system database administrators with ESC capabilities, was going to slow the development of equipment for the band and would make transition very, very difficult for those Part 90Z licensees that were going to transition to Part 96 rules. So WISPA made a wise strategic decision by partnering with the Utilities Technology Council, and they filed a joint blanket waiver, made very strong arguments about why the slow development of CBRS equipment, the slow certification of SASs, and the fact that the FCC was not going to be able to issue final rules and start a new rulemaking to move from census tract licensing to county licensing was going to slow the transition. WISPA was doing a lot of meetings with the FCC staff as well as with commissioner offices between 2018 and much of 2019. We started to realize in December 2019 that we weren't getting much positive feedback from the FCC during our meetings, and we started to get really worried. So in February, around February, we started to realize that maybe we should narrow our blanket waiver request, and instead of asking for January 8, 2023 as the extension timeframe, we should narrow the scope of the extension period from 2023 to December 2021. We also, because of the folks that had opposed our 2018 blanket waiver request were making arguments such that if the FCC granted our extension, it would delay the proper transition to Part 96 CBRS and the authorization of GAA, General Authorized Access users in the band. We also decided to back away from our request that we received grandfathered protection zones that extended also into 2023. Next slide, please. We kept meeting with the FCC, and we started to raise before the FCC how the quickly evolving COVID-19 pandemic was having impacts also on the certification of Part 96 equipment for WISPA members. That would include the access points, but as well as the customer premises equipment. And after discussions with the FCC, they, on their own motion, decided to grant an extension until October 17, 2020. And they did this on March 19th, last week. The FCC said that it was basing its decision on the hardship that the evolving nature of the COVID-19 pandemic would cause Part 90Z licensees, and especially those who are working diligently to transition to Part 96 rules. The FCC dismissed the WISPA UTC blanket waiver petition because it was moot, but they dismissed it without prejudice. The FCC also dismissed the pending 47 individual waiver petitions. The FCC stated that grandfathered wireless broadband licensees protection deadline was extended until October 17, 2020. If you recall, I was talking about how we narrowed our blanket waiver request to walk away from that grandfathered wireless protection zone. And we were just going to be treated as GAA, and essentially have a Part 90Z license, have to coordinate with GAA users. But this order actually gave us an added bonus or benefit by allowing our protection zones to be extended beyond April 17, 2020. An important aspect or detail in the order is that the Commission stated that it would suspend acceptance of new site registrations for all Part 90Z wireless broadband licensees in the 3.65 band, effective with applications received on or after the adoption date of this order. Next slide, please. So what's important to remember from the FCC's decision is that if you need more time, if you're an individual Part 90Z licensee and you think that the equipment that you need, the particular equipment that you need from certain manufacturer is not going to be available, or there are other unique circumstances that are not going to enable you to transition to Part 96 rules by October 17, 2020, then you're going to have to file another individual petition. What's also beneficial about this order is that it provides some real insight into how you can help yourself if you find yourself in this circumstance. You need to describe good faith efforts to purchase, install, and test necessary upgrades or equipment required to operate your networks according to Part 96 rules prior to the October 17, 2020 deadline. You must be able to discuss or identify unique or unusual circumstances that created a particular hardship on you from completing that transition. And then you should also identify the specific steps, including the time required to complete those steps that you will take. I'm sorry. The first two bullets are about the efforts that you try to make to comply with October 17, 2020. The third bullet is important too, and you have to demonstrate how you're going to try and come into compliance if you cannot meet the October 17, 2020 deadline. Thank you very much, and I guess we'll turn it over to Steve and Richard to talk about other aspects of CBRS.
Okay, thanks, Louis, and good opportunity for me to recognize the outstanding work and effort you put into working on that waiver. I know firsthand that you spent a lot of time on it, and the members should be very thankful that our efforts helped achieve that result. I did happen to look in ULS yesterday, and that the licenses that were to expire on April 17th have already been changed in the FCC's record. So your April 17 expiration date should now say October 17. So good to see the FCC moving quickly on those administrative things. All right, I guess we'll talk a little bit about CBRS, and this is kind of going back in time a little bit to the beginning of where the basics of the band, but 3 tiers of access. There are 2 tiers in the 3 tiers in 3550 to 3650, incumbent access, which is government use and earth stations. We have an upcoming auction for priority access licenses. This is protected spectrum, and 70 megahertz of that 100 megahertz will be available for auction. And then you have GAA, which is licensed by rule. It's not unlicensed. There's a registration requirement with a spectrum access system. In the top 50, you just have the incumbents that are there now, and the rest of it is going to be GAA as we navigate through this transition and folks convert their Part 90 operations into Part 96 and register their gear with the SAS. Next slide, please. So what is general authorized access? It's available nationwide in that 80 megahertz, 50 in the top and 30 or more below that. And where there is not a PAL operating, that will be treated as GAA spectrum, opportunistic use. So in other words, if let's say there's spectrum that doesn't go sold at the upcoming PAL auction, that would be treated as GAA until the FCC decides it wants to conduct another auction. Or if you're a PAL holder, but you haven't built out yet, somebody else could use your spectrum when and where you are not using it. You have to defer to the incumbent tier and the PAL use. All that's dictated by the spectrum access system. And the spectrum access system is going to identify and resolve interference among priority access users. But when it comes to GAA, the SAS operators will adopt their own policies, and not every SAS needs to treat WISPs or anybody else the same way. And as you know, GAA became available on January 27th of this year, following an extended initial commercial deployment, essentially a large field trial. So we're ready to go. Folks who are interested in deploying GAA, make arrangements with your SAS, either directly or through a manufacturer, and you should be able to use your certified Part 96 gear under these new rules. Next, please. So priority access licenses, these are assigned by the SAS after the auction that is scheduled to begin on June 25. 70 megahertz of spectrum that's available. You can only get up to 4 licenses in a particular county. These are county-based licenses. If you have 4, you can't get more by leasing it under a long-term lease. So the 4 is not just owned, but it's leasing under a de facto transfer lease or a spectrum manager lease either. You do not get an exclusive right to a particular channel. You just get a 10 megahertz channel, and the SAS decides where that's going to be and can make changes in where that 10 megahertz is based on the algorithms and protocols that are built into it. Next, please. Okay, as mentioned, the PAL auction is going to begin on June 25. It's a county-based auction, and there are approximately 3,200 counties, so a total of 22,000 PALs available altogether. These PALs have 10-year license terms and performance requirements at the end of that term. And there are bidding credits available. Again, 55 million and 20 million gives you a 25% or 15% bidding credit. Those numbers are average gross revenues over the last 3 years. You can also get a 15% bidding credit if you're serving predominantly rural areas that have fewer than 250,000 subscribers. You cannot combine these to get a 30 or a 40% bidding credit. It's one or the other. Next, please. So I know there's another session on CBRS Auction, so we won't do a deep dive. I encourage you to watch that session when you can. Do know that there's a short form application window that will be open from March 26 until April 9. Your upfront payments are due May 21, and then the auction is going to start on June 25. There are joint bidding, consortium, and joint venture rules and required disclosures in your short form and your long form regarding any agreements. Beware of the anti-collusion or the prohibited communications rules. They start on April 9th and go through the end of the auction. There are also restrictions on if you're a small business or someone that's claimed a bidding credit and you sell to a large company, you're going to have to pay what's called unjust enrichment payment to the FCC, because otherwise their because the purpose of the rules is to have small businesses hold the licenses, not flip them. And as mentioned before, there's a 4 PAL limit in any particular county, and that does include long-term leases. Next, please. Couple of more auction procedures. One, minimum opening bids are calculated per county on a 0.2 cents per megahertz pop with a minimum of $1,000. You have to maintain a certain level of activity. You just can't sit out certain rounds and then decide to jump back in. That's regarded as being unfair. So you'll have a certain amount of eligibility that when you put your upfront payment, you're buying bidding units, and you have to spend a certain amount of those bidding units in every round. Obviously, that will decline over time, and as it does, you lose eligibility and you lose your ability to bid in a particular area. When everybody uses up their eligibility or stops bidding, that's when the auction is over. Next, please. Okay, Richard, I think it's time for you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks for a great summary on CBRS. I'm going to talk about 2 topics here with regards to CBRS that are the moving forward topics. One to deal with the auction, and I don't have a slide for it, but I'm going to walk through a few of the things you should be watching for and prepare for in your due diligence while you're looking at doing, if you're considering acquiring a PAL in auction 105. And then we're going to go into the secondary market, which is a real opportunity for WISPs. If you are a smaller WISP or a medium-sized WISP, actually doesn't matter what size you are, and you want to access the PAL portion of CBRS, but you don't feel that you can afford the auction or don't want to go through the auction procedures, I'm going to describe to you what you can do to get into the marketplace. There will be opportunity. It's as given in Part 96, the rules for CBRS, there will be an opportunity for getting some secondary market access, whether by lease or by disaggregation or purchase of some portion of a PAL holder's PAL. But first, let's talk a little bit about what we're calling auction impediments. And these are more warning zones, things you should keep in mind. That if you're going to be bidding on a PAL, you should understand that not all PALs are created equal. And by that, I mean each PAL is the same in size. It's 10 megahertz, and it does cover the same geographic area within a county. County's different size, but it's a county area. And as Steve said, you can acquire up to 4 of them. But within the parameters of what is PAL, there are things that may cause your particular PAL area or your particular assignment based upon what the SAS assigns to you. And the SAS is responsible for the assignment of PAL frequencies to affect your use and enjoyment, if you will, of that particular section of frequency in a PAL. First, as you all know, there's areas around the coast of the United States and a few inland areas that are protected for the United States Navy and military radar systems. In order to protect for those radar systems, 3 companies so far have deployed what's called environmental sensing capability devices. Those ESC devices are themselves a sensor/radio. And because of the sensitive nature of where the Navy is putting their Spin 43 radar systems and other radar systems that are affected in the band, they don't want you to know where they are at any given time. The same thing applies to the ESCs. ESCs will be deployed along the coastlines of the United States in a few select inland areas. You need to work with your SAS before you get going to understand where or areas, if you're going to be bidding, there may be ESC sensors. It's not a public matter to where those ESC sensors are, and the sensors themselves must be protected by the SAS. So it is possible for an ESC sensor to cause some issues with PAL frequencies if they happen to be within the contour of protection. So one of the impediments to watch out for is the placement of ESCs. Second impediment is out-of-band emissions. There can be out-of-band emissions within areas where there are PALs, and that is supposed to be coordinated by the SAS, and you will need to coordinate with your SAS if you are receiving noise or problems with your band when it comes into play, there are 3 additional PAL slots that are not the assigned slots for which a PAL can be moved if an incumbent comes into place or if there's a need for it. So it is possible that you could be moved. Remember, PAL frequencies are not static, they are dynamic. Next is FSS, or the fixed satellite systems. Fixed satellite systems have to be protected, and most of them are known. So you can look up or work with your SAS on where they're located, but it's a good idea to know where those FSS devices are, especially if they're using full band and full arc. You want to know where they are and the amount that they have to be protected, and if it's going to affect the PAL that you're buying. Quiet zones are another. And the final thing that you have to do is coordinate with your SAS to make sure if you're buying multiple PALs at once. So if you're not just buying 10 megahertz, let's say you're buying 20 or 30 or even 40 megahertz, the rules give the SASs a lot of discretion about how to assign those frequencies. They prefer that they be continuous and that they be continuous between counties if you buy multiple counties. They do not demand them, and if you do the math, you will find if in all the permutations that there are for the number of ways that these PALs can be purchased, that it's not going to work out that everyone gets them contiguous. So these are some of the things you should keep in mind when you're looking at buying a PAL. Look at the region that you're going to be going to. Talk to a SAS or two about what's the best strategic approach on these things. Make sure you don't get caught by these impediments. Now for the more exciting area. Those of you who've worked with me in the past on how will I get into GAA and how will I ever afford a PAL? Well, the way you will be able to use GAA is like anyone, it's open marketplace. But in the areas that we're not talking about opportunistic or regular GAA frequencies, you may have an in to be able to buy into what's called the PAL secondary market. And it's guaranteed that there's a marketplace for this under section 96.32 of the secondary market. Of the Part 96 rules. Secondary market offering can be a lease. It can be a disaggregation, which means a breaking up of the PAL itself. It can be a sale. And the great thing about it is the PAL holder can work with individuals on the areas that they're going to use in their PAL and the areas that they're not. One of the hallmarks of the secondary market, though, is that every participant in the secondary market must qualify or be a qualified entity to operate in the secondary market. That actually means most of you who are WISPs in the United States, but you do need to make sure if you're going to participate in the secondary market that you have the right to do so. And it's at the option of the PAL holder. So the PAL holder may determine it's for a period of time. It can be a short period of time. Say you're running a golf tournament or you're running an event and you want to buy into this market for a short period of time, you can do that. Or it can be a large lease, similar to what you would do for a long term over a wide area. It might be that the PAL only is really interested in the large population center, and the rest of the rural areas they're not so interested in and they want to make some money off of it. Secondary market will be a methodology where we will identify market makers, those people that want to sell, lease, or disaggregate their PALs, and they will work with either brokers or directly with you to be able to come up with what you need. So that's an opportunity to work in a small, even a large area at a much reduced cost over what it would be to bid in the auction. Now remember that until a PAL holder actually registers in what's called a PPA, a PAL protection area, that area is not in use. Even if they've bought the PAL, even if they're designated as the holder, even if they've reserved the right, until they put that device out there in the field and register it with the SAS as a PPA, the GAA use is permitted and you can use it. So you can use it under a lease, you can use it opportunistically, you may be able to purchase some of this in the secondary market, you may have a temporary use that you could use it for. Those are all secondary market benefits. And it's really important to this market. Let's move to the next slide, please. Why consider the secondary market? I think I've gone through most of these. It gives you the license type protection, though it's not a full license in the same sense as going out and buying a license for spectrum that might cost you $500 million, it does give you SAS protection. It gives you a dynamic assignment of spectrum that is protected as an incumbent or as a holder of PAL, and you have the ability to do that just like the PAL holder in the secondary market, and you get the rights that the PAL holder would have. You can structure transactions to be paid over time. You can structure the transactions to work much like any lease agreement does. So you have the ability to negotiate the transaction with the party that's selling it to you or leasing it to you. And it allows the lessee or the purchaser to tailor the use to your particular need. For a specific spectrum, perhaps, size of spectrum, perhaps, or a particular geography, and it allows that area that's not valuable to an existing PAL holder to get used. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over now to, I'm not sure who's doing C-band, but Steve to cover the C-band.
Let's talk about C-band. So C-band covers 500 megahertz between 3,700 and 4,200 megahertz. Right now, it's used by receive-only earth stations for cable head ends and video reception. Under a 1967 policy, they enjoy something called full band, full arc protection, even if they're not using the full 500 megahertz, and most of them are not, and they're not using the entire orbital arc. The band is also allocated for point-to-point use, but there's been limited activity in the band for that sort of thing, only about 100 licenses or so. And those are frequency coordinated kinds of uses. So 2.5 years ago, WISPA helped form something called the Broadband Access Coalition that filed a petition for rulemaking with the FCC saying, hey, let's allocate this band for point to multi-point under Part 101, kind of a unique approach to Part 101, which many of you are familiar with. Instead of frequency coordinating point A to point B, it would be frequency coordinating from point A to multiple points within a sector. And because there was a fair amount of spectrum here, we said, let's not let everybody get it. Let's establish 160 megahertz cap, and you can only get 40 megahertz at a time, so that we can avoid spectrum warehousing. Next slide, please. About a year later, the FCC adopted an order and notice of proposed rulemaking, and the NPRM proposed that the band be cleared, or at least a portion of the band be cleared, and that C-band earth stations be relocated into the upper part of the band. For fixed, the FCC sought comment on the Broadband Access Coalition proposal for a portion of the band as well, and asked for technical information on how do we promote clearing, in other words, avoiding interference to these receive earth stations, and also sharing what are the protection requirements if we were to have co-channel or adjacent channel sharing between earth stations and point to multi-point use. Next slide. So a lot of stakeholders got involved here. Something called the Cband Alliance, which is the 4 large C-band satellite companies, Intelsat, SES, Telesat, and Eutelsat, asked for a private auction of 300 megahertz or more. This is where they said, we'll conduct the auction and we'll take care of doing this. FCC, you don't need to bother with that. A lot of opposition from just about everybody else to this kind of proposal, which would be a very novel approach, and had some questions about whether that was even legal. Satellite industry didn't like sharing with fixed services, and neither did the broadcasters. They claimed that this would create interference protection issues and might make the transition for them more complicated, but their real motive may be to limit encumbrances, in other words, new uses in the band, so that they can sell off the remaining portion of the spectrum sometime down the road. The mobile industry has been looking on accessing the lower 300 megahertz of the band, and WISPA and others in a broad coalition have shown that responsible sharing can be achieved. Dr. Jeff Reed from Virginia Tech put together a study showing that earth stations typically require only about 10 kilometers of protection from a fixed point to multi-point, operations, and that there would be this would make available significant deployment opportunities in rural areas, 80 million people, which is 78% of the continental coverage. So we eliminated, we believe we eliminated any sort of technical questions about our proposal. Next slide, please. So February, just last month, the FCC adopted an order, and it said we're going to take 300 megahertz and we're going to auction 280 megahertz of that. We're going to clear it, and there's going to be a 20 megahertz guard band. The auction is going to begin December 8. There's going to be 14 licenses of 20 megahertz each. Likely to be partial economic areas. These are 416 multi-county areas around the country that the FCC has used before for spectrum auctions. They're not proposing any aggregation limits. So conceivably, unless that changes, a Verizon or an AT&T or even a WISP could get access to all 14 of those licenses and 280 megahertz. In the meantime, we're following that. The earth stations are going to get relocated from the 3.7 to from 3.7 to 4 gigahertz to the upper 200 megahertz. And in exchange for that, they're going to be getting $9.7 billion in auction proceeds as an incentive to move quickly off the band. There's going to be an independent clearinghouse that's going to handle these payments and relocation. Sadly, the FCC said we're not going to adopt sharing of the upper 200 megahertz at this time. We do hope that the FCC will consider that down the road as the earth station transition moves forward. The FCC's thinking here is that they have a lot to do with this transition. There are earth stations that are going to be moving from here to there, and there's concern because there's nothing in it for the earth stations that they will be taking on additional responsibilities and interference potential if the FCC were to complicate this transition with introducing point to multipoint services at the same time. Next, please. So we talked before about looking at 2.5 and also looking at these two other bands when you're trying to decide what your mid-band strategy is going to be. This one kind of does a side-by-side just looking at CBRS and C-band. So for CBRS, we're looking at an auction here in June. For C-band, it's going to be in December after the RDOF auction. We have county-based auctions in CBRS and PEAs in the continental US. No auction of any C-band spectrum outside the continental US for now. CBRS, you have 10 megahertz licenses. Over in C-band, you'll have 20 megahertz licenses. You'll have 7 licenses with a 4 license maximum, so 40 megahertz, whereas over in C-band is 14 licenses, and right now no limits are proposed. CBRS has a 10-year license term, and C-band is 15 years, but you have to undertake some band clearing before you're going to be able to use that spectrum everywhere in your PEA in most cases. Next, please. Okay, I think we go back. Yes.
I got one thing to add in there. The opening bid prices for both of the auctions are out there, so you can right now go look and figure out what area you might want to bid on and at least what the opening bids and deposits are for those. Those are out there if it helps you compare your spectrum or which auction you might want to participate in.
Right. Okay, I think that's the end of that section, and we I move up into the 5.9 and 6 gigahertz bands. So I think this is Louis.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That was great comparison and analysis of CBRS and C-band. 5.9 is also a really exciting band for WISPs. And that's largely because in November 2019, the FCC adopted an NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, proposing rules that I put here largely agree with WISP's position. And let me back up and explain what I mean by that. As I was mentioning with the CBRS blanket waiver, the history of this proceeding is similar in the sense that it really dates back several years prior to what the FCC did in November 2019. And that's because the WISPA, among others, who've been asking the FCC to allocate more unlicensed spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band that is adjacent to the Uni 3 band that is so heavily used by WIFs in the past, was really getting nowhere with the FCC for really approaching 4 years. And that's what makes the FCC's proposal in November 2019 so encouraging. And it was also, and actually this is kudos to the current FCC administration, because this was a courageous move by FCC Chairman Ajit Pai. This is a ban that has been heavily fought over between the automobile safety manufacturers, automobile safety community, and automobile manufacturers, and folks like WISPs, fixed wireless service providers, as well as cable companies who really want the to make more use of unlicensed spectrum, because they realize, especially the cable guys, they realize that there's a great demand for Wi-Fi in-home connectivity. But for WISP, fixed wireless service companies serving rural areas, this is particularly helpful for them to connect underserved rural and other underserved areas. And another important aspect of this is that it would allocate the lower 45 megahertz part of the band. So the band itself goes from 5.85 all the way up to 5.925. What the FCC would do is, in the lower 45 megahertz band, the one closest to or adjacent to Uni 3, the one currently being used, it would allocate 45 megahertz of that for unlicensed operations to support high throughput broadband applications. This Uni 4 band would have the same technical rules as Uni 3, and this could lead to large contiguous blocks of unlicensed spectrum. And there's several options for this contiguous blocks of spectrum. It could be 2 80 megahertz Wi-Fi channels, or 4 40 megahertz Wi-Fi channels, or a single contiguous 160 megahertz Wi-Fi channel that would do great in rural areas. There's and the other exciting aspect of this is that the FCC chairman also proposed to, in the upper 30 megahertz portion of the band, to allocate that for transportation and vehicle safety purposes. Now, the automobile industry, Department of Transportation, has been trying to use this band for what is called dedicated short-range communication safety, auto safety technology. It hasn't really developed kind of useful safety communication devices and services that they'd hoped that it would. And they've been working on it, as I mentioned, for 20 years. In the past couple of years, other car manufacturers have developed a new technology called cellular vehicle to everything, or CV2X, that is incompatible with DSRC. And so they have to work that out, the automobile industry and those competing technologies. And I think it was really intelligent for the commission to ensure that there would be 30 megahertz of spectrum allocated for them. And the reason why, again, I just want to emphasize, the reason why we believe this is a win for WISPA in many ways, it's a policy advocacy win. It's because WISPA has been asking for this channelization or band segmentation approach since 2016. And I want to give my kudos to Steve Curran for his advocacy dating back that far on this issue. Next slide, but I believe that's 6 gigahertz is the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Louis, and I appreciate that on 5.9. And as you can see, we kind of have a trend here. All kinds of spectrum that's in play, perhaps more in play than I can remember in the past decade. And I foresee that continuing, especially with the NTIA's report on shared spectrum coming up, and the ability to reuse and experiment with spectrum in different ways than have been done in the past. So the good thing about some of the ones that we're going over today is that they're not all auction spectrum. They're not all sold to a particular party at a very high price. You have the ability on a lot of these bands to come in and use them. And some of them we've got wins, some of them we don't, but we're pushing very hard. WISPA is pushing very hard at every point we can in order to progress and gain access to bands. And 6 gigahertz is no different. This is a very large band and a very controversial one, and one that no doubt will have a lot of different input and use, and is in play at the moment. It's not finalized. We don't know what the outcome will be. There are incumbents in 6 gigahertz. 6 gigahertz lies in a couple of the bands that are currently used. In fact, they're used by WISPs in license format for point-to-point licenses, along with large providers like AT&T and other companies who have licenses for point-to-point. There are also satellite uplinks within that space that fall within 5925 and 6425 megahertz, and a few public safety and other uses. So those are the incumbents that are presently in the band. WISPA and other interests are interested in enabling higher power point to multi-point uses on a shared basis without interfering with the current incumbents. So for example, if you're using long distance point-to-point licenses, you need to be protected so that your backhaul is maintained, and in the same way that the cellular industry and other industries need that backhaul to be maintained. What is sought is within 2 bands, the Uni 5 band, which is 5925 to 6425, and the Uni 7 band, which is the 6525 to the 6875 megahertz range, to come up with a methodology that recognizes where incumbents lie and protects them. It's a little bit like CBRS in the way that a SAS protects current incumbents within CBRS, but this would be a much more streamlined approach using something called an automatic frequency coordination device. And this is very good for the idea of sharing both outdoors in a higher power and a lower power use indoors. And come to the next slide, please. So we and a lot of parties did some technical analysis looking at the feasibility of sharing in 6 gigahertz and determined that there were a lot of reasons technically why this should work. And we looked at it and we said, first off, the existing incumbents are visible and known. So we know where the point-to-point devices are, we know who licensees are, we know what they're using them for, and we know what the fixed satellite systems are. They're recorded in the Uniform Licensing Service of the FCC, the system, and you can look them up. And in fact, there were some inaccuracies in that, and the FCC is going through and polling the FSS devices that are out there to make sure that 1, they're still operating, and 2, that what their use is, and 3, where they're located so they can be protected. And the vast majority of unlicensed devices operate indoors, so only about 2% of the fixed infrastructure for unlicensed devices is deployable outside. Fixed service links typically utilize an extremely high quality antenna and have a mean fade margin of about 30 dB. More than when ACM is factored in. And that allows for very diagnostic use. And there are differences in signal geometry and elevation between fixed use and unlicensed systems. And finally, the dominant impairment in an FS link performance is things like multipath fading, brief peaks that can exceed 40 decibels, and generally those occur from midnight to about 8 a.m., well after the RLAN busy hour. So if you take into account those technical areas, they're very capable of creating a device, an AFC, that would be able to understand those factors and share with the existing users the ability to use the same spectrum in a shared fashion. Next slide, please. So in this line, WISPA had filed comments in February of 2019 asking for higher power outdoor use in Uni 2, Uni 5 and Uni 5 and Uni 7 bands, and they would do that under AFC control. And there are a number of companies out there who are seeking to develop a applicable AFC control. AFC is not new. The concept of having automatic controls within a radio that can identify certain parameters such as proximity of an incumbent, power levels, and other things. It has been out there for quite some time. And this would allow for outdoor access points and high power clients to operate under the control of the AFC, thus protecting the incumbents. And AFCs will be fairly easy to coordinate. This is a little bit different than CBRS SAS. While SASs are very established, very technical coordination entities and algorithms, AFC would be built into the equipment and would be under a simple coordination, almost automated coordination system. And one good thing on our side is that the Wi-Fi industry favors these things. And there, as you know, there's a lot of proposals out there for the Wi-Fi industry to extend Wi-Fi devices. The 802.11ax standard, which is also commonly known as Wi-Fi 6. Don't mix up Wi-Fi 6 with 6 gigahertz. It's the standard for the use in this band and other bands. But the ability for the Wi-Fi industry to extend from current Wi-Fi frequencies into 6 gigahertz makes them very supportive of this band, as we are supportive. Of course, the pushback, there are two pushbacks that we have to be cautious of, and ones where we can use WISP's input all the time and throughout this process to make sure that the spectrum becomes available. The first is incumbents believe that there can be no interference at all. And that tolerance level probably is a little bit too highly stated, but there are protection methods that can come pretty darn close to that and still allow high power sharing outdoors for multi-point. The second is our normal foe in this sort of thing. The cellular industry would like to dominate all of this for 5G. And while we appreciate the need for 5G, there is no need specifically for them to dominate half or all of this. Originally, proposal that we saw on the table was that they would take 50%, and that's the CTIA proposal. We are pushing back against that by saying the highest and best use is to get things into rural areas, to extend the most use for the country on Wi-Fi uses, and to provide for a diverse use of spectrum. So generally speaking, this is a band that can be used by a lot of parties. We need to get in line a little bit with the utilities and the public safety to make sure that they're not opposing the use of sharing. So that's what we have on 6 gigahertz. It's a very exciting band, and we really, really expect that this is something that we can look forward to. Let's move on to the next topic area. So many of you have heard, and some of you are using millimeter wave. But what exactly is millimeter wave, and how might you use it in your practice? First off, we're going to move up the spectrum band chart quite a bit, because these are not bands down in the mid band. They're not low band. These are very high frequency bands, and we're talking about say above 24 gigahertz and up. And they involve very, very high frequency transmissions. New uses for millimeter wave. I don't think anyone out there almost at all had heard about millimeter wave before the advent of the marketing of 5G. 5G has made millimeter wave almost the grand solution for the last mile for short haul rooftop delivery and sectorization and delivery in the last mile. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how you can use it in that fashion, and perhaps how it's not the be all and end all for the 5G mobile industry. Typically, millimeter wave has been used in the past for bridges. It is a very effective bridge. You can put through very high amounts of data very accurately in a short haul. Think things like campuses and medical facilities. If you're going between buildings, millimeter wave is an ideal format because you can take a very, very large amount of data and move it very quickly. You can't move it a long distance, but you can move it a short distance with a lot of data. And finally, there's lots of data, as I said, at very high data rates, short distances. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the different bands of millimeter wave, and there are quite a few of them. So I'm not going to cover them all, but I'm going to talk about which ones, some of the ones that are out there, some that are available right now, some that are going to auction, and some which may come up in the future. First off, some of you already use the lower band unlicensed 24 gigahertz Part 15 microwave, and that's available right now, and you can use that. Many of our suppliers provide equipment that can be used for short distance backhaul via 24 or delivery of specific campus-based needs. A lot of uses for 24, a lot of you use it, and it is available available today. There's the upper microwave flexible use service. This is 24.25 to 48.2, and this is auctioned and licensed. And I'm going to talk about some of the specific areas that were recently licensed as recently as January, bringing in rather substantial amounts of money to the United States Treasury. The upper band license, which is presently available unlicensed millimeter band. And this is one that some of you I know are dabbling in, because I've spoken to a few of you, some of you who are members of WISPA and some of you who should be members of WISPA are using a 60 to 80 gigahertz, it's really 57 gigahertz to 71 gigahertz, what's called the 60 to 80 gigahertz band. This is an unlicensed band that can put an amazing amount of data through in a short area, and you'll be amazed how small the antennas are and the methodologies that are being used, the mesh methodologies that are being used to deliver signals. And some of these are actually being deployed right now. I know of one in California that is actually quite effective. Then there's the lower licensed band millimeter wave, which is about 25.25 gigahertz to 28 gigahertz, and this is a licensed band, and it is auctioned. And then there's the two really higher ones, or the ones that have been given names by the FCC, Spectrum Frontiers, which totals, get this, 3,400 megahertz of spectrum, and just fell under auction 103. 103 just closed in February of this year for about $7.5 billion after 104 rounds of biddings. And you will see some very traditional names, even our friend Sprint and T-Mobile and AT&T and Verizon all got in on this one. And so there were quite a bit of sold rounds in the Spectrum Frontiers auction that was just closed in February of this year. And then there's the lower Spectrum Frontiers, which is still open to review, which is 37 to 37.6 gigahertz and is shared with federal incumbents. Let's move to the next slide. Moving up the band chart is the 80 gigahertz millimeter band. This is known as E-band, or the 70, 80, 90 gigahertz band. It actually operates under Part 101 in 71 to 76 gigahertz and 81 to 86 gigahertz, less 94 through 91.4, which is a reservation the government has taken in that band, but including 92 to 95. This is a band that some have used. There's been E-band communications around for a good at least 10 or 15 years. It is sort of underutilized, and I'm sure technologies with new antennas and approaches will allow higher frequency millimeter band uses going forward, but you should know about it. And then finally, the other FCC named millimeter wave that takes us way up on the charts is Spectrum Horizons. This is spectrum that is above 95 gigahertz. Don't stand in front of it, folks. Not much is used here, but this is open for the future. Let's move on to the next slide. So why would you consider and how would you use millimeter wave? First of all, understand that in any millimeter wave application, line of sight is critical. It's a very high frequency, very narrow band approach. And if you have fog or rain or dust, you get fade. And even the atmosphere can create fade in high frequency millimeter wave. And so you need to understand the propagation of the particular band you're using, understand that you're really not going to do this unless you're using a reflective sight in any other fashion than line of sight. And things like buildings and trees, going through them require some real special machinations. And as I just said, they're affected by weather and dust and so forth, clutter, terrain, and clearly the environment. But the benefit of millimeter wave is the huge amount of data that can be put through, and it can travel a decent distance. It's not going to do what 5 gigahertz does. You're not going to throw for miles with this without the risk of loss. And so what a lot of people do with millimeter wave is they use millimeter wave to do very large levels of service, but they understand the risks associated and they put a failover attached to it. Maybe it is 5 gigahertz or another radio. So when the sensitivity is affected, either it's affected or cut off, immediately the failover takes place so the network doesn't go down. And that's critically important to have good path quality. Let's move on to the next slide. So I'm going to toss this back to Steve to talk about all of the different auction dates, but that's millimeter in short. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Richard. I think we're getting to the end here, so hopefully those who got on at the beginning are still with us at the end. Couple of dates here. As of now, the April 9 is still the short form deadline for the CBRS PAL auction. Your upfront payments will be due May 21, and the auction is expected to begin on June 25. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund subsidy auction begins October 22nd. We don't have a short form deadline for that. The Cband auction is scheduled to begin on December 8th. We do not have short form or upfront payment deadlines for that. And the 2.5 gigahertz auction is more likely to be next year, could even slip beyond that. And one thing that may influence that is the 2020 election. And I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing CBRS, RDOF, and Cband come back to back to back, is so that the existing chairman can get those at least underway before there's regime change, if there is regime change. You know, what will happen with 2.5? Well, there are some educators out there that would love to see that band return to how it was, not be auctioned, continue to give it out to educators. So they may be playing a little bit of the waiting game along with their petition for reconsideration of the rules. So the election could have a lot of other consequences as well, with respect to auction start dates or revisiting some of these things, just like we did a few years back when we had a new president who opened up the CBRS docket under his watch, and the net neutrality rule. So always an interesting time, and you know, keep an eye on the financial markets. And obviously, as we record this, we're in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic, and all these things are going to have an effect, whether it's a ripple effect or whether it's a big effect, as we think about spectrum going forward. Next.
All right, thanks everyone for attending. This was supposed to be an hour session. We're at an hour 17. What do we want to do here? Do we want to try some questions, or should we wrap it up? And this is the part where our assistant should help out here. Okay. Let's
Mark, it's up to you. Go ahead, and if you had some questions that were canned, it would be good to do those, or we can just end. So it's your choice.
I have 3 from each of the presenters. I don't think we would possibly get through them. Let me try to throw a few of them out here, and we'll try and get done by an hour and a half. How's that sound? So we've been hour 18 at this point. Steve, you want to, or really anyone can weigh in on this. Why don't we take a shot at the various spectrum bands that are coming up, and where they're available, and which ones what would you weigh, trying to decide which one you want to bid on? Maybe we can combine a couple of the different question topics that were presented. Y25 versus CBRS versus Cband.
So I'll give my perspective. I think when you look at Cband, I think you're going to see a lot of the big carriers looking at that for 5G coverage. I'm not going to say it's off limits to folks here, but I think that's really what the large mobile carriers are looking at. I think when you look at the 2.5, that could be a Sprint and a T-Mobile play. Sprint's been in that band for a long time, and they've proposed to use that to build out to rural in-home broadband as part of their merger conditions.
Is that primarily west?
Yeah, I will say that I don't believe that Sprint is necessarily going to be looking to acquire every single rural county. So I think there will be opportunities there. And I think because we were able to successfully get the FCC to split that 100 megahertz into two pieces, that creates even more opportunities for folks to get a pretty significant chunk of bandwidth without having to buy spectrum they don't want to have. And also, same thing probably goes for other competitors in the market, that you will enable two potential winners for that spectrum. I know there's a lot of interest in CBRS, and there should be. This is a near-term opportunity, and I think those that kind of want to beef up their spectrum portfolio in advance of the RDOF auction, if they're looking at that, this is a really good opportunity there. I think some of the big carriers are going to be interested. Verizon has gone on record and said we're looking at CBRS for 4G capacity, not for coverage. So that tells me that they're looking at primarily urban markets where they need to build more capacity. AT&T, I think, is going to be focused more on the areas where they have Connect America Fund build out. And of course, the wild card in all of these is companies like Dish, or another company that is backed by private equity that would come in and stake someone. But that's sort of an overview of what the competitive landscape may look like. Obviously, your results may vary, and objects in your mirror are closer than they appear. So, focus on who the folks are in a particular county, whether it's a cable company or a mobile company, and that'll give you a sense as to, in each block, who might be interested in bidding.
All right, thanks. Did anyone else want to add to that, or?
Yeah, this is Louis. I would like to add to that. So yesterday's panel, we discussed some of the interesting use cases for CBRS, and they're quite varied, from neutral host networks, where you essentially set up a fixed wireless service to allow people to access, use their devices to access your network. This could be like in a mall, stadium, areas like that, hotels, to Internet of Things, telemedicine, artificial intelligence through, again, Internet of Things type of deployments. But the really interesting thing is that there's a lot of technology that will allow for cellular, but also for fixed wireless services. And because the geographic area licenses for CBRS are small, and therefore able for many of our smaller members to be able to acquire them, that's going to give them a lot of business models that they can think about, a lot of partnerships that they can think about. And I'll leave it to Richard to talk more about the secondary markets aspects, but when you look at the use cases that are so, the wide range of use cases, and the fact that our members already have 3.65 licenses and know how to use that kind of spectrum for fixed wireless services, I think that this is just a really exciting time for WISPA members, from our smallest members to our largest members, to get really involved, try to get into the auction, and try to even if you're not able to successfully win a PAL, take advantage of the secondary market option. And if you're not able, if you win a PAL, you can also use partition disaggregation and spectrum licensing rules to take greater advantage of a PAL by partnering with others. So thank you, Mark.
Yeah, all right. Let me just do 2 cents on the secondary market. I think what Louis,
Go ahead.
what Louis said is well, one thing I didn't concentrate on my segment. I think you should concentrate on it. If you are going to participate in this PAL auction, you can partition, and you can lease out the portions of the PAL that you're not using. So there is that opportunity as well for the auction winners to do that, and that can be WISPs as easily as it can be Cell or other providers. The other thing is that the secondary market combined with the primary PAL holder market combined with the GAA market makes a lot of different combinations and permutations. And with the advent of many of the new functionality that is coming out of what we will call 5G, and with specialized antennas, beamforming and MIMO antennas and others that are coming, your ability to do very specialized IoT and IIoT applications, and even private networks for providing service for specific entities that want their own networks are genuinely there. So let's underscore that as a reason to participate in some of these auctions.
Okay. Let's move on to a question about CBRS waivers. There was an extension of 6 months that was just granted by the FCC, fortunately, and grateful to have that. If you still need more time on that, what should you do about that? It's a good question for anybody, but Steve's probably as good as any.
Sure, I'll give it a shot. First thing you should do is do whatever you can to build out and to eliminate the reason for a waiver, which means replace all of your Part 90 gear with Part 96 gear, register it with the SAS, and you won't have anything to worry about. If you can't do that, you need to be prepared to tell the FCC, let's call it around September, if not a little bit before, the steps you've been taking, what your next steps are, what vendors you've talked to, what issues you have, are there unforeseen circumstances that got in your way. And then you need to file a very particularized, individualized waiver request with the FCC that spells all that out. So that would be my advice. The best advice is don't have to put yourself in the position of asking the FCC for relief. And then if you do, make sure you ask for a shorter period as you can, and eliminate as many of the potential problems, and don't give the FCC any reason to say no.
Well, one quick warning I want to add to that is that if you are currently an NN holder and you are an NN holder that has grandfathered wireless rights that have been extended through the October date, and you do want to make the transition, work with your SAS and with the FCC, because you will not be able to be both a 3.5 NN holder and a GAA operator in the same area at the same time. So you need to figure out when your cutoff is going to be, so that you can either terminate or end your license and go into GAA.
And I would just like to add one other point, Mark, if I might, and that is that what the one aspect of the order granting our 6-month extension is that the FCC did one other step that I've never seen. Well, I rarely see them do, which is to tell folks who want to file an individual waiver to identify the specific steps, including the time required to complete those steps that you will need to complete the transition after October 17, 2020. What they're telling you there, hint, hint, is that they anticipate that this may not be enough time for a lot of folks, and that's because of the shortcomings in the certification process that the equipment manufacturers are experiencing. And one other point, please do let us know if you are having difficulty. Please let me, Louis Peretz, know. That's my job to sort of try to help you with an advocacy strategy on how to get this over the finish line in terms of granting an individual waiver beyond October 17, 2020. One interesting legal procedural detail in the order is that they dismissed our motion because it was moot without prejudice, which means they're not commenting on the merits of our blanket waiver, which means we can make these arguments again. I know Steve doesn't want to hear that, but we can make these arguments again, especially when it comes to the inadequacies of the equipment certification process.
Okay. Is there a sweet spot so we've got a 6-month extension, how you don't want to ask right now and say, I'll never make it by 6 months. So I suppose you could, and you don't want to wait till 2 days before it expires. Is there a sweet spot that you would see for when you should be asking for an extension?
I would, go ahead, Lou.
Go ahead, Steve. All I was going to say is, if you're going through the steps Steve identified in terms of really trying to transition, and you're starting to figure out that it's not going to happen 2 months from now, 3 months, I would say 2 or 3. I mean, you have to continue doing this now, continue to make the transition. But if you're about 2 months or 3 months out and you can see that it's not going to happen again, then you need to start contacting us.
Yeah, what he said, you should be getting these waivers in, between 30 and 60 days from the October 17 deadline. So yeah, target 90 to 60 and then give yourself time to put together a compelling story.
Okay, great. That actually brings us to an hour and a half of our hour presentation, so I think we should wrap it up at this point. Thank you all for participating. Thank you guys for putting together a great presentation.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks,
Hope to see all of you in Vegas in the fall.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right, thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.